Hi, everybody. In Chapter 9, we're looking at some types of violent crime, including homicide, assault, and intimate partner violence that you might have associate that with domestic violence. Intimate partner violence is kind of the more contemporary term, and then family violence as well. So, first of all, let's define criminal homicide. Criminal homicide is causing the death of another person without legal justification or excuse. Now, every state is a little bit different in terms of having first degree or second degree murder. Murder is what you might think of as first degree murder. It is the unlawful killing of one human being by another with malice and aforethought, either expressed or implied. And that just means that it has premeditation attached to it. And premeditation can be, it doesn't have to be long. So premeditation can be a minute or a week or a month. But as long as there was some type of premeditation, then that would be murder, or in some states, first degree murder. And then you have non-negligent manslaughter. Sometimes that's called second degree murder. And that will be where there is no premeditation. So absence of malice or forethought. For example, if you're driving a car and you are drinking and you hit somebody, that's typically non-negligent manslaughter or second degree murder. So homicide laws do vary by state. Most have degrees, either first or second. Again, first degree would be willful, deliberate, premeditated. Second degree is killing without that premeditation. It can include things like car accidents or crimes of passion, things like that. In death penalty states, those states that have the death penalty, it is first degree murder or premeditated murder that will typically qualify for the death penalty. Second degree murder or non-negligent manslaughter. And again, this is no premeditation. Homicide, results from reckless or negligent behavior or a crime of passion. Those typically do not qualify for the death penalty. Now, in terms of violent crime, homicides reached an all-time high in 1991, and during that year there were 25,000 reported homicides. Now that fell to about 15,000 in 1999 and has remained fairly steady since that time. For example, there were just over 14,000 in 2010, which of course is still a lot. In 2010, there were 1.246 million violent offenses. So homicide actually represents only about 1.2% of all violent crimes in the United States. And that's when you're looking at the Uniform Crime Report Violent Crime Index for any given year. The vast majority of murders involve some type of relationship. There are very few attacks by strangers, even though we hear about those a lot, and they're kind of the scariest. But the vast majority of homicides do involve some type of relationship. So again, we have first degree, second degree, non-negligent, and again, it will just kind of vary by state. Aggravated assault is also considered to be a violent crime, and that would be listed in the Uniform Crime Report Index on Violent Crimes. Aggravated assault is the intentional inflicting of bodily injury on another person or the attempt to inflict such injury, often accompanied by the use of a deadly or dangerous weapon. Demographics and other factors related to some of these more serious crime categories. Most data that we see when we're looking at demographic factors are based on arrest rates, not convictions. Consistent findings show that African Americans are overrepresented in official crime statistics as both offenders and victims. African Americans make up about 13% of the U.S. population and about 53% of the arrests for homicide. That was in 2007. Homicide rate is almost 8 times higher than for whites in terms of victimization. Rates for African Americans is 6 times higher than whites. I'm sorry, it's 8 times higher with arrest rates and 6 times higher for becoming a victim. So African Americans are at a very high risk for victimization and disproportionately arrested for homicide. Now, this disproportional representation in both the arrest and convictions and even in the victimization is due to social factors that we don't often really want to pay attention to or certainly make an effort to change and on any large scale. We're talking about social inequalities when it comes to things like jobs, education. Um, just a lot of minorities in this country don't have equal access to some of the things that a lot of us take for granted. The idea that we can get a good education, that we can live in fairly crime-free neighborhoods, that we can get jobs that pay us enough money to live effectively. The other issue is the discriminatory nature and treatment at all levels of the criminal justice system. And that has been documented for years and years and years and years. So it has nothing to do with race, ethnicity, biology, or genes. It's really social inequalities that we have in this culture. Now, when it comes to gender and homicide, homicide is a young male category of crime. In 2010, the Uniform Crime Report data showed that 90% of the offenders that were arrested for homicide were male. Males also are more often the victims. 77% of males, at least in that year, and it's pretty consistent, were male victims. Half of all arrests for violent crimes are people between the ages of 20 and 29. So again, it is a young male category of crime. And again, we have a lot of conditions of some of those inequalities that we were just talking about, poverty, children born into adverse neighborhoods, disadvantaged families have a higher risk for violence with both becoming an offender and becoming a victim as well. I already mentioned that it is a young category of crime. And again, the reason that we see the specific demographics, particularly with minorities, it has nothing to do with biology or race or ethnicity or religion or anything like that. It has to do with social inequalities that really put people at a disadvantage at a very young age, and often growing up in dangerous neighborhoods as well. And when it comes to weapons used in homicide, 67% of all homicides in any given year, roughly, involve firearms. And we also see other type of instruments. They're not quite as common. Knives and cutting instruments, it's less than 13%. Every 14 minutes in the United States, someone dies from a gunshot wound. If you look at homicides versus suicide, half of all suicides, 44%, involve a firearm, and again, 60% of homicides involve a firearm. So weapons, particularly firearms, are very dangerous. And we kind of talked about the weapons effects in a previous chapter. Remember I told you about the research that was done making people angry in a room with either a toy gun or a badminton racket, and the people that had the gun in the room became even more angry. And I mentioned that there are theories out there suggesting that that's why we have higher crime rates in the South, higher homicide rates, and particularly you could even take that out and say why we have higher violent crime rates here in the United States than in other countries where guns are not quite as prevalent as they are here in the United States. So it's an interesting, remember I did say that the research after Berkowitz did that initial research on the weapons effect has not, there's not been a whole lot of research on that, but it's certainly an interesting theory to think about when you think about the violent crime rates in this country and weapons. All right, the psychological aspect of criminal homicide. Offenders who have committed a homicide that was precipitated by a general altercation or argument is one category. And by the way, this is a typology. A typology, by the way, is a way of classifying criminal behavior based on some type of motivation generally. So this particular typology that we're looking at right now was created in 2007 based on patterns and motivations of, in this example, 336 homicide offenders in New Jersey. And it's just looking at or trying to classify homicides into different categories based on some type of motivation. So the first one was general altercation, killing that follows some type of argument or altercation. Number two is felony commission, offenders that commit a homicide while in the process of committing another type of a felony, like robbery, rape, kidnapping. And this, by the way, is the largest number according to this particular typology, with 45% of all homicides falling under the category of taking place while another crime, another felony is being committed. The third is domestic violence related. Homicides involving some type of domestic relationship. This is the second largest group in this typology, with 25% of all homicides falling into this category. And then the last one is homicides after an accident, usually involving cars, often involves drugs and alcohol. A lot of different typologies out there, by the way, for homicide. Psychological aspects of homicide. So we're just taking kind of a closer look at some of these categories, some of the more common categories anyway. Again, general altercation homicide usually involves some type of hostile aggression, can be reactive violence as a result of some real or perceived threat or insult or attack. The goal is often to make the victim suffer. And then we have, remember we talked about that hostile attribution bias, and these are just kind of cognitive biases that we have. Remember when we talked about the cognitive biases and kind of the thought processes that may happen because of early childhood experiences, we're on autopilot thinking, and so we kind of automatically jump to these conclusions. So hostile attribution bias, if you remember, is people who have a tendency to view even minor or innocent situations as threatening or aggressive. They are easily provoked and tend to have impulse control problems, based on that bias. Easy emotional arousal, which leads to anger, aggression, and violence, as we mentioned in a previous chapter. Self-regulation is a key factor. Self-regulation is the capacity to control or alter one's own behavior or emotions. We often see self-regulation problems in people that have a hostile attribution bias, or who just have kind of generally high levels of aggression. And remember, self-regulation and impulsive behavior is regulated by the frontal lobes. And again, the frontal lobes don't mature until we're about 25. And if you have some type of cognitive deficit from either being exposed to something during the prenatal environment or just during childhood, you might have, kind of permanent deficits in the frontal lobes. One of the most important factors in protecting a person from developing violent behaviors is self-regulation, being able to control your own emotions, your own impulses, anger, aggression, having having the emotional skills to be able to solve problems without resorting to violence. And we've kind of talked about that in some previous chapters. So some people just have, for whatever reason, a very short fuse and they go straight to aggressive behavior. And of course, that can and often does lead to homicide. Felony commission homicides. Remember, this was the number one category with that particular typology that we were talking about. And that typology suggested that probably 45 to 50% of all homicides take place while another felony is being committed. Tend to be motivated by instrumental aggression, which is aggression for the sake of obtaining something. We talked about that in a previous chapter. Violence can be proactive or reactive. Proactive tends to be intense and calculated. Reactive violence not initially intended or planned, but ends up happening while committing some other type of crime. So the violence is part of another crime, typically robbery, rape, burglary, and kidnapping. The expectation of rewards is really what motivates the behavior, whether that is, monetary goods or some type of emotional reward. Offenders that fall into this category tend to have a history with the criminal justice system. They tend to start young, so they're involved in other types of crimes. All right, juvenile homicide offenders. With juvenile homicide offenders, the majority take place during some other type of altercation or the commission of a felony, which we were just talking about. The Violent Crime Control Act of 1974 made it a federal offense to sell or transfer a gun to anyone under the age of 18. It's also illegal for minors to possess ammunition. However, juveniles do get guns. They get them from community members, older friends or family members, pawn shops, gun shops. I mean, a lot of illegal ways that young people get their hands on weapons. Theft is a big issue with juveniles. 500,000 guns are stolen each year from residents, from different types of shops, pawn shops, and a lot of those end up in the hands of juveniles. 70% of the firearms used by offenders are obtained through theft, including those that are used by juveniles while committing some type of crime. In 2010, 9% of the offenders arrested for homicide were juveniles, and 94% of those were males. And we already talked about how homicide just tends to be a young male category of crime, and that that same pattern falls if you're looking at juveniles in terms of gender. When you're looking at those 15 or younger, 15 years of age or younger, the percentage is very small. Between 1980 and 1997, 2%, which was 600 cases, involved a child. But think about that, 600 homicides involved somebody under the age of 15 as being the offender. Parent is rarely the victim, often single incident like a drive-by or a gang shooting. More than half, 58% of juvenile homicide victims are also juveniles. So juveniles often shoot or kill other juveniles. More than half, 54% of the victims of juvenile offenders were killed with firearms. And sometimes, like I said, they take place in the commission of some other crime or a felony or for a drive-by or gangs. But we also have playing with guns as being a factor, particularly with some of the younger offenders and victims. When it comes to juvenile offenders, the psychological characteristics, no evidence of psychoses or serious mental health issues. They do tend to have a history of severe educational difficulties, lack of parental monitoring. We've kind of already talked about some of the red flags and early childhood experiences that just lead to antisocial delinquent or even criminal behavior. When it comes to demographics, most do have a history of conduct disorder. Homicides also involve other criminal behavior, as I talked about before. Half of the victims were strangers, and half of the victims were family members, friends, or acquaintances. They tend to have a history of educational difficulties. And remember, we talked about how educational difficulties lead to peer rejection. If you have educational difficulties related to being able to communicate effectively, that often causes frustration, and then young people turn to violence as a way to deal with adversity. In one study, 78% had learning disabilities and 86% failed at least one grade. We talked about verbal abilities measured by IQ tests tend to be below average. Significant language handicaps appear to be the most prevalent learning issue with juvenile homicide offenders. And they do tend to have, as we have looked at previously, a history of family and parenting issues. All right, when it comes to violence, we are talking about violence that takes place in within a family setting. We do have here at the university a class called Family Violence that is really interesting and goes into all different aspects of family violence. So we're talking about domestic violence, we're talking about child abuse, violence between siblings, violence between children and their parents, elder abuse. I mean, it's a really interesting class. I highly recommend taking it. It's a really important and interesting class. One of the things about family violence is that it is one of those dark figures of crime. Remember, we talked about crimes that have a history of not being reported to the police, and family violence, all of those different crimes that fall under that category, would have a very high dark figure of crime. So when you look at official crime statistics, you're actually not getting the full picture because a lot of these crimes are never reported to the police. Now, if you do look at official crime statistics, you'll see that rates have declined since the early 1990s. Terminology makes it a little bit difficult to get accurate statistics because we have things like domestic abuse, interpersonal violence, child abuse, child neglect, child maltreatment. So there are a lot of different labels and terms that are used. But when we're talking about family violence, we're talking about not just physical violence. We're also talking about psychological harm. We're talking about verbal abuse. When we're talking about children, we're talking about neglect. And there are a lot of different things that we're looking at when it comes to family violence. The prevalence, one of about every 5 murders and non-negligent manslaughters in the United States involves one spouse killing another spouse. A little less prevalent is a child killing a parent or a child killing one of their siblings. Homicides of one spouse are often followed by suicide, and that is a neglected area of research. So how much family violence is there? What are the common characteristics of offenders and victims? Is family violence fundamentally different from other kind of violences? And what are the causes of family violence? And these are some of the fundamental questions researchers seek to answer, and that you'll definitely look at in terms of really more in depth if you decide to take that family violence class. It's a really interesting and important class. So first, let's talk about child maltreatment. And when it comes to child abuse and neglect, it includes physical abuse, emotional neglect, sexual abuse, child neglect, and missing and exploited children. It also can involve, as you see here, family abduction, and that is typically one parent abducting a child that they don't have custody over. So 1 in 7 children here in the United States is maltreated at some point. Emotional abuse is the most common in most research findings, and that includes things like name calling and humiliating a child. A lot of children are poly victims, meaning that they have experienced four or more victimizations over the course of a year, and it's usually not just one type. So they might have emotional abuse and neglect, or physical abuse and neglect and emotional abuse. Most are associated with mental health problems and bad outcomes for victims or children who are victims of some type of abuse. Victim rates 12 per 1,000 children, and that has been stable over the past decade. And again, this is only cases that we are aware of. In 2001, Child Protective Services had 2.6 million reports of possible maltreatment. Think about that for a minute. 63% involved neglect, 19% physical abuse, 10% sexual abuse, 8% emotional abuse. Ages 0 to 3 is where we see the highest rates of victimization, and then rates tend to decline as children get older. Most prevalent pattern is neglect by female caretakers. Boys and girls are abused equally, but girls are 4 times more likely to be sexually abused. And there is a connection between pet abuse and child abuse. We talked about pet abuse earlier, so there is definitely a connection between people who would abuse pets, and then also abuse their children. Again, highly underreported category of crime, and 0 to 3 being the highest age for victimization. Now, thrown away and runaway children. Thrown away children are basically kids who have been thrown out of their home at any age under the age of 18, and parents have really just stopped being interested in them. And then, of course, runaway children are those that leave on their own accord. The vast majority of kids that run away from home are trying to escape some type of abuse or neglect. NISMART is the National Incidence of Missing, Abducted, Runaway, or Throwaway Children. It is a nationwide database that tries to keep track of statistics. In 1999, 1.6 million young people had run away or were thrown away, and in most cases, 71% of those, the child could have been endangered while on the street, and that's actually probably a little bit higher. Most of the runaway and thrown away children are between the ages of 15 and 17. All right, when it comes to child abductions, this is the thing that, parents' nightmares are made of. So the vast majority of child abductions are by non-custodial parents, and no harm is ever done to the child. Very few, statistically speaking, very few child abductions are by non-family members. However, when we do have a non-family member child abduction, there tends to be kind of what we call a stereotypical pattern. So these are abductions by strangers or even slight acquaintances. And they're called stereotypical, by the way, because they tend to follow the same pattern. Children are taken from their home, usually their bedroom, and sexually assaulted and then unfortunately killed. And it's usually, within the first 24 hours. And by the way, most victims are female. Since 2000, there have been about 115 per year. 40% of those result in death in the first 24 hours. 4% of cases each year, the child remains missing. The first 3 hours are critical because 2/3 are killed during this time frame. 32% of surviving victims require medical attention for injuries. There's definitely a sexual motivation, very common. Half of all victims, and it's probably a little higher than that, but half of all victims are sexually assaulted. 2/3 are female between the ages of 6 and 14. Females around 11 tends to be the biggest target, or at least the highest risk. So females around age 11. Most abductions occur within half a mile of their residence, if it's not in their own residence. Other types of family violence, you may or may not have heard of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is a really odd syndrome. This is where a parent usually just one parent, consistently and chronically bring a child in for medical attention with symptoms falsified or directly induced by the parents. In other words, the parents make the kids sick and then take them in for medical attention. And it's because parents want attention. Sometimes this ends up with fatal consequences. I mean, parents are giving kids all kinds of medications to make them sick, giving them even chemicals to make them sick. And again, it is for medical attention. Research shows that females are more likely to be the offenders. They tend to come from all socioeconomic status backgrounds, and victims are often between infancy and about age 8. It's not terribly common after age 8. Males and female victims males and female children are victimized equally. And again, 90% of the time, it is the mom who is engaging in this behavior. Shaken baby syndrome. This is when a baby shakes, a parent or caretaker shakes a baby so hard that serious head injuries result. This is for usually infants under the age of the year. When babies are born, they have a very weak connection between the head and spinal column. And so it just takes very little shaking to actually do damage. We don't have a lot of accurate statistics on that, but serious head trauma is the leading killer of abused children. Over 50% of children that are killed by child abuse, it involves some type of head injury, and so shaken baby syndrome would be part of that. Not all victims of shaken baby syndrome die. Some suffer significant permanent brain damage as a result of being shaken. All right, infanticide is the intentional killing of an infant. Intentional, not the result of some type of neglect. The United States ranks 5th in the world for infants under 1 being killed. That is 5.4 per 100,000 live births, and that's a terrible statistic for the United States. Neonaticide is a term used to describe killing an infant under 24 hours old, and then filicide is killing an infant over 24 hours old. Depression and mental health issues are often involved with the offender. 24% of filicide cases involve postpartum psychosis, and the mom is usually the offender in these cases. The Andrea Yates case, which I mentioned in a previous chapter, the mom that killed 5 of her children, and I told you that she had a long documented history of postpartum psychosis. She would be an example of that. So most of the offenders that kill their infants are moms. All right, intimate partner violence. And again, you probably have heard of this as domestic violence. This is just a newer term, intimate partner violence, that is being used because when we talked about domestic violence, it kind of implied that it was between, a man and a woman who lived together in a marriage situation. And when we use intimate partner violence, it kind of is more encompassing of all types of intimate relationships. So it is physical, psychological, and sexual violence perpetrated by individuals in either a present or past intimate relationship. They do not have to live together for this to take place. So again, domestic violence would be a term that we might use. Family violence would still be a term. And again, this is one of the reasons it's hard to kind of define and look at statistics sometimes, because people are using different terminology. But we're trying to get to IPV so that everybody's on the same page when we talk about intimate partner violence. It can be same-sex or non-heterosexual relationships, or heterosexual, doesn't matter, any type of intimate partner relationship. So when it comes to the demographics, first let me talk about, it doesn't have the here. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of things. First, battered women's syndrome, and I've mentioned this in a previous chapter. It is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. The National Family Violence Survey that was done in 1995 and 1996 said 6 to 8.7 million women are battered annually, and some will go on to develop battered women syndrome. And I mentioned when I talked about battered women syndrome previously that it has been used as a criminal defense. It is an anxiety disorder where a woman is the victim of repeated abuse. Not all women will develop it. Not all women develop severe emotional, psychological, trauma. But anybody that experiences any type of abuse over a period of time is probably going to develop some issues. Low self-esteem, low self-efficacy, learned helplessness, and depression are all issues that we would find with women who are the victim of some type of intimate partner violence. And I mentioned that it has been used as a criminal offense. Now, when it comes to the same-sex domestic violence, we don't have a lot of research on it. Most of the research that's done on intimate partner violence is done with heterosexual relationships. So this is really an area where we need a lot more research. The research that has been done suggests that we have even higher levels of violence. One survey that was done in 2000 said 44% of gay men had suffered physical abuse in their relationship, and 50% of gay women had experienced physical or at least some type of abuse in their relationship. So those are really high statistics. So we definitely need more research. When it comes to intimate partner violence with law enforcement and military families, these are career, being law enforcement or being in the military, that inherently have a lot more stress. We also have people who are engaged in really authoritarian work, and sometimes they bring that, not only the stress, but that kind of authoritarian personality that they need for work home. And so we do see pretty high levels of intimate partner violence with spouses of law enforcement officers or within military families. All right, when it comes to the characteristics of abusers, there's a lot of research that's been done over the past few years on victims as well as abusers. An interesting study was done by Christine Ratchey in 1993. She examined 155 mate homicides in Florida and found the following characteristics in terms of motives. So this is one person who had murdered their partner. And the motive was, in 48% of the cases, possessiveness, self-defense in 15%, abuse by victim 2%, and feelings after an argument 20%. They have found that alcohol abuse is common. It does not cause intimate partner violence, but it tends to kind of escalate things between partners. Men who abuse children tend to be incompetent, immature, overwhelmed, and frustrated by parenting. Hotsworth, Monroe, and Stewart in 1994 created a batterer typology. And type 1 batterers are those who abuse family members only. Type 2 abuse family members because of emotional problems, and they tend to have mental health issues, high levels of stress, high levels of anxiety. And then type 3 are just generally violent towards everybody. So again, alcohol can play a role. It doesn't cause it, but it tends to exaggerate it. Now, we also find insecure attachment styles for both batterers and victims. Remember, we talked about attachment style in a previous chapter. All right, when it comes to elderly abuse, estimated incidence of specific types of elder abuse. Remember, we have baby boomers who are all moving into old age. So we have a lot more elderly people in this country than we have had previously. That puts a lot of older people at risk for abuse. So 2.1 million victims per year of some type of abuse, widely underreported. Most abuse victims are older white males between the ages of 75 and 85 who are middle to lower class, and the offender who engages in violence toward elderly people are usually their adult children. Sibling to sibling violence. This is actually pretty common form of family violence, but it's usually not reported. And we have done very little research on sibling to sibling violence, because I think a lot of people have this idea that sibling rivalry and, fighting among siblings is very common, which it is, but it can cross the line into real type of violence. 70% of a sample in 2005 study, a study done in 2005, said that they had engaged in some type of violence toward their siblings at least once. That includes things like punching, choking, beating up, threatening to use a weapon, and actually using a weapon. And again, this is just not regular sibling violence or just, bickering between siblings. We're talking about real violence here. Sibling violence is linked to violence in dating relationships, family violence in adulthood, and non-family adult violence in general. Families with only sons have more sibling violence than those with only girls. Boys just tend to be more likely to go to this level of violence than girls. In 2002, a study was done, and 72% of sibling killings involved one brother killing another brother, 14% a brother killing a sister, and 14% a sister killing a sister. So this would be another area of research. That brings us to child to parent violence. 60% of children who attack their parents have witnessed violence between their parents. So most children who engage in violence toward their parents have grown up in a family where violence was present in some level in the house. In 2010, 25% of family murders involved children killing a parent, committed most often by males. So that's at a ratio of 3-1. So boys are more likely to kill a parent than girls are. Mothers are killed more often than fathers by both sons and daughters. Dorbin and O'Connor in 1989, came up with a typology for children who kill their parents, and that's the typology that you see here. It's called parricide. Number one, severely abused children. The vast majority have grown up with some type of abuse going on in the house. Number two, severely mentally ill children. And number three, the dangerously antisocial child that we've kind of already talked about, some of those early red flags, conduct disorder, things like that. All right, multi-assaultive families. This is called the circle of violence, a continual cycle of intrafamilial violence, aggression. When you grow up in a home where there's violence, even if you don't experience it as a victim, just witnessing violence in the household can do as much damage as actually being a victim. So those children who experience violence or witness violence are at greater risk of becoming abusers and becoming adult victims. There is this circle of violence. If you witness it or experience it as a child, you are more likely to grow up and be an offender, and you're also more likely to grow up and have attachment issues and get involved in violent relationships as a victim. That cycle of violence can happen to anybody. Anybody who is victimized or who witnesses any type of violence as a child is at risk of engaging in that cycle of violence. It's just repeating those patterns that you learned. Now, the effects of any type of abuse on children, or even witnessing abuse in the household. So those who witness violence or who are direct targets are at risk for that lifelong offending or becoming a victim. Also have lifelong emotional, cognitive, and psychological issues, including depression, aggression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. low self-esteem, maladaptive coping skills, drug and alcohol issues, getting involved with abusive relationships, not having good, as we talked about, good coping mechanisms, or knowing how to effectively resolve conflict, and so turning to aggressive and even violent behaviors as a way to deal with adversity. All right, so lots of great resources for this chapter in the module, so make sure you take a look at those. If you have any questions about anything that we talked about, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.